Good morning again. As I was communicating with Pastor Doug by email, one of the things that I shared that I've been thinking a lot about recently has been on the topic of grace and what it means to be a church of grace or a people of grace. One of the programs that we have of our AIDS department at the Bible College is called Churches for Grace. And this has come out of 30 years of observation of the church not responding well to the HIV and AIDS epidemic. One of the things I didn't mention is I also have a master's degree in public health. And so HIV is a public health issue in Kenya. In fact, more than 1 in every 20 adults is infected with this virus. And yet it's an old story in North America now. Our media doesn't cover it much, and people think that that's a problem that's been solved long ago. Well, imagine if 1 in 20 adults in America was infected with the Zika virus or with Ebola virus. Imagine the hue and outcry that would be. And yet that's the way it is in Kenya with the HIV virus. Last year, 2015, we had over 1,500 teenagers die from AIDS. And it's not because, most of these teenagers, by the way, were born positive. And they were able to be on antiretroviral drugs, anti-AIDS drugs, until they reached their adolescent years, and they stopped taking their medicines. Why? Because they were living in communities that wished they were dead. They had no self-esteem. They'd been a lifetime of being told that they were worthless. Now imagine an adolescent who is trying to learn who they are and find their place in their culture, their society. But ever since they were children, they've been told, you're going to die young. You're not going to live a normal life, and then you're going to die. And we have no place for you. Being told, we don't want to waste money on school fees because you'll never be able to use an education. They hear this in church, not just in communities. They hear this in their schools. They die because their families, their churches, their communities, their schools, the communities that should be nurturing them and supporting them is tearing them down, is casting them out, is ostracizing them, is stigmatizing them. And so they stop taking their medicines. We've even had some who have committed suicide. 1,500 adolescents no longer living in this world died last year. And it wasn't necessary. What are our churches doing to be agents of reconciliation for them, to be agents of grace? Now, we believe as God's people that we have been given a message. We've been given the message of reconciliation. In fact, we're told in 2 Corinthians 5:18, if you want to look it up, that we have been given the ministry of reconciliation. Who are we reconciling? The people that sit in the pews Sunday morning? Or the people out there who don't even darken the doors of a church because they perceive the church to be a place of judgment and condemnation? Now, I have never been in a church that didn't perceive itself to be a loving and friendly place. But you go out into the communities, to the people who have not grown up in church, and you ask them their perception of the church. It's a place of condemnation, not a place of love. We have to do better at preaching the good news. The gospel, after all, means good news, right? So what does good news actually look like? Guess what? I've got great news for you. You're going to spend eternity in hell unless you believe the way I tell you that you should believe. Is that received as good news? For those who are sick, good news means healing. For those who are hungry, good news means food. For those who have no income, good news means there is money to pay the rent, to have shelter over their head. There is money to pay school fees for their children, so their children can have hope for a better future than they have. We met a widow in the slum of Kibera who had come from western Kenya. Her husband had died, and then she began to have some sickness, and the rumor began to spread in her church that she had AIDS, that her husband had died from AIDS, that she had AIDS. And just that rumor alone, she hadn't even been tested yet. That rumor alone, the church basically cast her out. We don't want people like you here. You're a sinner. We don't want sinners in our congregation. Can you imagine how empty our pews would be if we got rid of all sinners? You sure wouldn't be having me speak to you this morning. And so basically she was told by her church, don't come back. You're not welcome here. This is not a unique story. This happens frequently all over Kenya. Where did this come from? It came from early on, in the early years of HIV, early years of AIDS. HIV infection was associated with sexual immorality. And therefore, it became an instrument of stigma and condemnation. And anyone who was HIV positive was assumed to be so because of their own personal sin. It was their own fault. They'd made their bed, let them lie in it. What if Jesus had had that attitude towards us? Would he have died on the cross for us? No. And so the people who most are desperate to hear good news, what they know, or think they know, is the church is the last place that you can go to hear it. Because there all you get is judgment and condemnation. And that's not just in Africa. That's all over North America. Fewer and fewer people are involved in church because they don't see it has any relevance to their lives. It's not preaching the good news that they're looking to hear. Why would you go to a place that will condemn you? We need to learn how to be places of grace. Let's look at this for a moment. In our New Testament reading, in John chapter 1, verses 14 to 18, I want to look particularly at verses 17 and 18. Verse 17, for the law was given through Moses. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Verse 18, no one has ever seen God, but he, that is Jesus Christ, has made him known. No one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only, that is Christ, who is at the Father's side, has made him known. Now, we see the law in verse 17 juxtaposed against grace and truth. And we were reminded just before we read together the prayer of confession that no one was ever made righteous by the law. And I think we would all agree with that. And yet, all too commonly in our churches, and particularly in Africa, which tends to be very, very conservative, especially on social issues, the approach to spirituality is one of law. You do the right things, and you don't do the wrong things. And this comes actually from a traditional worldview, which is animistic, in which one's relationship with the spiritual world is based on what you do and do not do. So that if you do wrong things, the prevailing spirits, whether it's the ancestor spirits or depending on the particular tribe, the spirit of the air, the water, the fork in the road, whatever, if you do the wrong things, they'll curse you and bad things will happen to you. If you avoid doing the wrong things, hopefully they'll just ignore you and leave you alone, and maybe things will go well with you. But your relationship to the spirit world is based on what you do and don't do. That's a very legalistic approach. There's no concept of grace in there. We have a hard time with grace even in our culture. It's not very well understood. And people want to feel like they deserve their salvation. So they work very hard to please God because they want to feel like they deserve the grace he's given them. But by definition, grace cannot be deserved. Are we together? That's a very Kenyan way of saying things. Are you with me? Okay. So what we tend to do is that we judge people according to whether or not they measure up according to the Scriptures. Now, I'm not saying that we shouldn't rely on the Scriptures. I hold the Scriptures very, very dearly. But the Scriptures were not given to us as an instrument of judgment so that we could judge other people. They were given to us as a guide to guide our own actions, to reveal the priorities of God and help us to walk in those priorities. So we read that Moses brought the law, but Jesus Christ brought grace and truth. So I want to focus a little on grace. There's not time to focus on truth. That's also very important. It's interesting that grace and truth come together, and neither one of them are a part of the Mosaic law. It's not that the law doesn't contain truth or the law doesn't contain grace, because it does. But Moses brought a system of law, and Paul tells us, the Apostle Paul, that the purpose of the law is to show us that we need a Savior, that none of us measure up, that all of us need grace. And after showing us our need for grace, Jesus came to reveal grace and truth. And verse 18, that Jesus Christ has made him, that is God, known. No one has ever seen God, but Jesus Christ has made him known. I love when Jesus is talking with Thomas, and Thomas says, "Show us the Father, and that will be enough." And Jesus said, "You mean you've been with me all this time, Thomas, and you don't know who I am? He who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, 'Show us the Father'?" So what helps me is to understand that if you want to know what God's heart is like, if you want to know what his priorities are, if you want to know what his values are, look at the life of Jesus Christ. Look at his teachings. Look at the way he related to people. Now, he had opportunity to be legalistic. You remember the woman who was caught in adultery, who was brought to Jesus. And they thought, the Pharisees thought they had Jesus over a barrel here. The people, they loved him because he was full of grace and truth. And he was very affirming of them, welcoming of anyone. The Pharisees didn't like that because he was a friend of sinners. Well, thank God for that, because he's my friend. And he wouldn't be if he weren't a friend of sinners. And so they say, well, according to the law of Moses, this woman should be stoned to death. What do you say? And they're thinking that Jesus was going to either have to deny the law, which is what they wanted, so that they could accuse him of blasphemy, or he would have to say the woman should be stoned, and then he would lose his following. They really thought they had him over a barrel. I wish I knew what Jesus was writing in the sand there. Apparently that was important, or the gospel writer wouldn't have included that. But Jesus then finally spoke up, and he said, well, and he didn't deny the law. He said, let him who is without guilt cast the first stone. And nobody could. So Jesus was upholding the law, but he was saying the first priority is the welfare of people. People. God loves them. He desires their restoration. He desires their reconciliation. He knows that we're broken on the inside. He knows that. In fact, that's why Jesus hung on the cross for us, so that we could be reconciled to God and the Spirit of God could begin to do His work in us of healing our brokenness, of putting us back together. And our congregations need to be places where that happens, where broken people can feel comfortable being welcomed, being put back together, being healed on the inside. That would make our churches places of good news. And I think if our churches were that kind of place, we'd be packed out every Sunday morning and every Wednesday evening and whenever the doors were open. Well, Pastor Doug, I might be in trouble because I forgot to look at my watch and I have no idea when my time is up. But you see, we have a great need for being a place of grace, because the law chases people away, like this woman that I told you about. The church chased her out because they labeled her as a sinner. How are we, as the people of Christ, going to reach out to a world that is broken, that is hurting, that is in darkness, if first we have to judge whether they're worthy of God's grace, and we hold them up to the standard of the law? Well, of course they're not going to measure up. Even we ourselves don't measure up. The law is there for a purpose, but Jesus brought grace and truth. And the church is to be the presence of Jesus in the world, not the presence of Moses. It is grace and truth, not law, that reveals the heart of God. Are we ambassadors of law, or are we ambassadors of grace? So, what happens when the church lacks grace? First of all, we misrepresent God's character, because grace and love are a huge part of who God is. And as we say, a half-truth is as good as a lie. So if the world looks at us and it sees a place where they can find judgment but cannot find grace, we're actually misrepresenting God to the world, misrepresenting Christ. Secondly, the church slides into Phariseeism when there's no grace. The Pharisees were condemned by Jesus Christ because they held the law as being more important than the welfare of the people. God's heart is for the people. So we slide into Phariseeism, where standards are more important than people. The next thing is we alienate the very people that Jesus Christ is trying to call to himself. Who needs the good news of the gospel the most? Those are the very people that we end up driving away. The very people that Jesus died on the cross for, and we're telling them, we don't want you here. Measure up first, and then we'll accept you. So the world judges Christ based on his people. And if what they see is judgment and condemnation, not grace and mercy and love and compassion, then it feels justified in its rejection of Christ. So what happens to the church then? It stagnates. And we're seeing a lot of stagnation in the church in America today. We're starting to see it in Kenya too, because it becomes ingrown, it's repulsive to others, it stops growing, it enters into spiritual decay, and begins a process of survivalism. The main goal of the church is just to survive, not to reflect the heart of God to a broken and hurting world. And so what we need is a church that reflects the values and the heart of God to a world that he gave his only Son to reclaim and to redeem. We need to become places of grace where people get what they don't deserve. Where people who are broken and hurting can come and receive welcome, redemption, healing, restoration. That doesn't happen without sacrifice. And a church whose focus is survival will not sacrifice. Can we trust God enough to reach out and use the resources of the church, not knowing where they're going to come from, to do the work, to continue the work that Christ entered the world to begin? Not to get crucified all over, but to be a representation of the love and the compassion and the restoring grace of God into the lives and the hearts of people who are wounded, who are hurting, who are struggling. Without sacrifice, that won't happen. But God, amazingly, seems to be able to channel the resources that are needed into the hands of the people who are spending themselves doing his work. It's amazing how that happens. We have seen it so many times. So let me encourage all of us to remember that our calling is not to be a people of judgment. Satan is the accuser. God is the judge. We as the church have not been given either of those roles, but to be a people of grace, of healing, and of restoration. Thank you for allowing me to share these few thoughts with you this morning and to enjoy fellowship with you. And God bless you.